Gardenia is so common in Malaysia that most of us have stopped noticing how unusual this company actually is. You see it in supermarkets, petrol stations, convenience stores, neighborhood grocery shops, and sometimes an entire section of the bread aisle is filled with its products. But behind every loaf is a business far larger than most Malaysians realize. In 2025, Gardenia Bakeries Kuala Lumpur recorded 436 million Sing dollars in sales. That is roughly 1.4 billion ringgit, or about 330 million US dollars, in a single year. Its operations in Peninsular Malaysia run out of 8 factories, producing approximately 3.8 million units a day. And despite being one of Malaysia's most recognizable food brands, Gardenia Malaysia is not owned by a Malaysian founder. It is a 50-50 joint venture between a Singapore-listed QAF and a Malaysian shareholder inside the TradeWinds Group. I'm Tim Tia, and I've spent about 20 years building companies in Malaysia, and I make videos breaking down how businesses here actually work under the hood. If you're into this kind of thing, subscribing generally helps get these made. So how did a company selling affordable loaves of bread become a billion ringgit business? And how did it end up dominating the bread aisle so completely that most of us even stopped questioning it? The answer starts with an American baker in 1969. His name was Horatio Slocum. Slocum had spent 35 years in the baking industry in the United States. In 1969, he was sent to Malaysia by the International Executive Service Corps, an organization that placed experienced American executives with businesses in developing markets. His assignment, according to Gardenia's own published story, was to start a bakery. The more detailed version, which gets repeated widely but does not appear in Gardenia's official records, placed Slocum in Sabah working alongside a local businessman. Either way, this was not yet the Gardenia operation we recognize in Peninsular Malaysia today. What arrived in 1969 was knowledge, recipes, commercial baking methods, and an understanding of how to make soft, consistent bread at industrial scale. The business that would eventually carry that knowledge was built somewhere else first. In 1978, Gardenia began operating as a small in-store bakery at Bukit Timah Plaza in Singapore. In 1983, it opened its first proper commercial bakery at a place called Pandan Loop. Remember that name because it comes back at the end of the video in a way that you will not expect. In 1985, QAF acquired the business. Singapore gave Gardenia something invaluable, a compact market in which to prove that packaged bread could be manufactured at scale and delivered while still fresh. That detail matters more than it sounds. Bread is genuinely difficult to industrialize. A biscuit manufacturer can produce goods that sit on shelves for months. Bread has a much shorter commercial life. Produce too much and you create waste. Produce too little and the shelf sits empty. Deliver too slowly and freshness suffers. So expansion required more than a good recipe. Gardenia needed to forecast demand, manufacture large volumes consistently, and get product to retailers inside a narrow window. Once that model worked in Singapore, Peninsular Malaysia was the much larger prize. It was also the much harder logistical problem. Singapore is compact, but Peninsular Malaysia stretches across cities, towns, and small communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. Gardenia was not simply entering a bigger market. It was attempting to make a highly perishable product available across a geographically scattered one. Gardenia Bakeries Kuala Lumpur was established in 1986 with its Malaysian operations centered on Shah Alam. The first loaf rolled off the line that same year. It entered a market where Malaysians were mostly buying bread from independent and neighborhood bakeries. So Gardenia did not invent bread consumption here. What it popularized was a particular kind of bread business, a nationally recognizable brand with standard production, sealed packaging, consistent texture, regular replenishment, and a product that tasted more or less the same wherever you bought it. That sounds ordinary today, but in the 1980s, building that consistency at industrial scale was a serious achievement. Gardenia was effectively asking Malaysians to trust a brand name instead of the bakery down the road. In 1991, it commissioned its own fully automated factory capable of producing thousands of loaves an hour. And the business kept compounding from there. This is where it gets interesting. Most companies would love to sell an affordable product that people buy over and over again. But affordable products leave very little room for error. A few ringgit from each loaf has to cover ingredients, packaging, factory labor, machinery, electricity, warehousing, delivery vehicles, retail distribution, marketing, and waste, which is anything that goes unsold. So Gardenia could never depend on making a lot of money per loaf. It had to make the entire system efficient. And every time the business got larger, it gained another advantage. Higher demand supported larger factories produced more efficiently, and more production supported a wider product range. A wider range gave every delivery route more to sell, and a stronger distribution system made it easier to reach more retailers. It became a reinforcing loop. Gardenia was not just scaling a bakery, it was scaling a manufacturing and distribution platform. QAF's 2025 annual report discloses Gardenia Malaysia's numbers directly on a 100% basis. Revenue of 436 Sing dollars, EBITDA of 37.1 million Sing dollars, and profit after tax of 13.3 million Sing dollars. If we convert the profit figure, we roughly land at around 43 million ringgit, or about 10 million US dollars on 1.4 billion ringgit of revenue. That's a net margin of around 3%. And that tells you something important about bread. It can be an enormous revenue business without being an enormous margin business. Gardenia's scale comes from repetition, not from the markup. It has to manufacture and distribute huge volumes while protecting the very few ringgit it earns on every transaction, which is a far harder business than most people assume when they look at get a loaf of bread. But Gardenia did not build this position without a fight. Its most visible historical rival was Hi-Fi, produced by Silverbird Group. Silverbird at the time was the only listed packaged white bread manufacturer on Bursa, and it was not a minor competitor. It was investing in capacity and chasing large supply contracts. For a while, Malaysia had a genuine contest between two large packaged bread brands. Then Silverbird ran into serious corporate and financial trouble. Silverbird announced in February 2012 that it had discovered financial irregularities and had become an affected listed issuer under Bursa Malaysia's Practice Note 17. Then in September 2013, the Securities Commission charged two former directors with furnishing false statements relating to revenue reported in the company's audited quarterly accounts for 2010 and 2011. In 2020, both were acquitted on a separate set of 134 charges involving Maybank, but in November 2022, both pleaded guilty to one charge each of furnishing false statements to Bursa and were sentenced to 1 day of imprisonment and a fine of 500,000 ringgit each. The company itself was delisted in October 2014 with accumulated losses of over 460 million ringgit and ceased operations in June 2016. Now, none of that was caused by Gardenia, but while its main listed competitor was dealing with financial distress, regulatory action, and eventual delisting, Gardenia stayed operational and kept expanding. In a category like bread, operational continuity matters enormously. Customers do not postpone breakfast because the supplier is restructuring. Retailers still need product on the shelf. So when one supplier becomes less reliable, the demand does not disappear. It just goes somewhere else. Gardenia already had the manufacturing capacity, the consumer recognition, and the distribution coverage to absorb it. Silverbird's collapse did not create Gardenia's entire lead, but the disappearance of Hi-Fi removed its most recognizable challenger. With Hi-Fi gone, there is a second competitor in this story, and that's the one that's still sitting on the shelves today, next to Gardenia, Massimo. And Massimo is a completely different kind of threat, entirely because of who owns it. Massimo launched in March 2011, produced by the Italian bakers RM Berhad, a wholly owned subsidiary of FFM Berhad. FFM is the largest flour mill in Malaysia. It is 80% owned by PPB Group, part of the Kwok Group, with Wilmar holding the other 20%. Sit with that for a second because it's the entire point. Gardenia buys flour. Massimo's parent company mills it. The Massimo bakery was built at Pulau Indah in Port Klang, a 120 million ringgit plant located right beside FFM's own flour mill. That is vertical integration. Your single largest raw material cost stops being a cost and becomes a transfer between two parts of the same group. And here is where this story loops back on itself in a way I did not expect when I started researching it. According to Gardenia's own published account, it stopped buying flour from FFM around 1998. The reason it gave was that FFM had begun supplying a new competitor. A bakery and its flour miller share recipes and ingredient specifications extremely closely, so Gardenia said it saw a conflict of interest it could not resolve and moved its orders to Malayan flour mills instead. Massimo sits inside PPB Group's Consumer Products division. In the first half of 2022, the entire division reported pre-tax profit of 14 million ringgit against a PPB net profit of 997 million ringgit, roughly 1.4%. The reason is that the overwhelming majority of PPB's earnings come from its stake in Wilmar International. Now, think about what that actually means competitively. For Gardenia Malaysia, bread is the business. It is where all the revenue comes from and where the entire cost structure lives. For Massimo's owner, bread is a rounding error attached to a flour mill. One of those companies has to make bread work. The other one can afford to be patient for a very long time. And this is not ancient history. QAF's own 2025 annual report notes that Gardenia Malaysia held its leadership position despite a slowdown in consumer goods and competition from new entrants in the bread segment, which is a very corporate way of saying the fight is still ongoing. The strongest part of Gardenia's model may not be any individual product. It may be the infrastructure built around the products. Think about the economics of a single delivery stop. A truck pulls up to a supermarket carrying only one type of white loaf. The revenue that stop can generate is capped. Now picture the same truck carrying white bread, wholemeal, flavored loaves, cream rolls, buns, cakes, wraps, waffles, and instant noodles. Same vehicle, same driver. And it's the same retailer relationship, but far more product moving on every visit. That doesn't mean that every product succeeds. What it means is that Gardenia can use infrastructure it originally built for bread across many categories. So its competitive advantage became much larger than a brand name on one loaf. It includes factories, product development, forecasting, retailer access, delivery routes, and consumer familiarity. A competitor can make a good loaf. Replicating their entire system is a completely different level of expensive. That is the real reason scale matters in packaged bread. The larger player can use existing infrastructure to launch more products. Those products then make the infrastructure even more productive. There's another part of the story that gets oversimplified constantly. Gardenia Bakeries Kuala Lumpur was previously 70% owned by QAF, with Bernas holding 30%. In 2016, QAF sold a further 20% stake to Bernas for 90 million ringgit, roughly 30 million Sing dollars at the time. That turned the Malaysian operation into a 50-50 joint venture. Then in December 2025, QAF announced that Bernas intended to transfer its full 50% stake to Tradewinds Malaysia. QAF described it as an internal restructuring because both companies sit under the same ultimate corporate parent. The other half remains held through QAF, which is listed listed in Singapore. QAF's own annual report identifies its chairman, Lam Sing Chung, as a controlling shareholder with around 31%, and his son Lin Kijian, one of the joint group managing directors with around 39%. Together, that's roughly 70% of a company that produces one of Malaysia's most familiar household products. So the honest description is not that Gardenia is entirely Malaysian or entirely foreign. Gardenia Bakeries Kuala Lumpur is a Malaysian operating company, structured as a regional joint venture. Gardenia's regional manufacturing footprint is still changing. On 20th May 2026, QAF announced that Gardenia Foods Singapore would shift bakery production from its Pandan Loaves facility to Johor Bahru. Production in Singapore was scheduled to cease on 30th of June 2026. The move affected 141 employees, with roughly 250 remaining in Singapore afterwards. Gardenia said that the decision was intended to improve operational efficiency and maintain competitiveness, and that Singapore would remain its hub for brand management, product development, quality, and regulatory oversight. It will also handle distribution and supply chain. Now remember what I told you at the start of this video? Pandan Loop was Gardenia's first commercial bakery, opened in 1983. It is the plant where the whole thing became a real manufacturing business. And in 2026, that is the plant that stopped baking. The Gardenia model was proven in Singapore, the brand then expanded deep into Malaysia, and roughly 4 decades later, production crossed the causeway in the opposite direction. This does not mean that the Singapore business is disappearing, but it shows how the economics keep shifting. Bread remains price sensitive, ingredients and energy costs move, delivery is expensive, and consumers notice price increases immediately. And retailers still need fresh stock every single day. Scale gives Gardenia real advantages, but it doesn't remove the underlying difficulty of the business. Gardenia's story began with an American baker bringing commercial baking expertise to Malaysia in 1969. The model was proven in Singapore. Gardenia Bakeries Kuala Lumpur was established in 1986, and by 2025, annual sales had roughly reached 1.4 billion ringgit. The growth did not come from one dramatic invention. Gardenia combined several advantages and let each one strengthen the next. Consistent products built trust. Trust created recurring demand. Demand justified larger factories. Factories supported more products. And more products made the distribution network more productive. And that network made Gardenia one of the most visible names in Malaysian food retail.